Good day. If you're listening to this, you must be in Mrs. Rodriguez's first or fourth hour. We're reading We Are People. And what I've done is I've created the video so you guys can follow along. If you choose to do the reading on your own, that is fine. I'm just giving you this option as kind of like an added feature. So here we go. Lesson 2. How does the government secure natural rights? The purpose of this lesson introduces you to some basic ideas the framers used in creating the kind of government they thought would be best protect the natural rights of each individual and promote the good of all. When you finish this lesson, you should understand the difference between limited and unlimited government, the difference between written and unwritten constitutions, and how Americans have used the term constitutional government. You should be able to explain why a government with a constitution is not necessarily a constitutional government, and be able to identify alternative models of government that the founders had to choose from. So there, right below that is terms to know. You do have a worksheet that I'm expecting you to go ahead and complete given you've listened to this lesson, okay? That goes on for the critical thinking exercises. Just think about those. You do not need to do those. And the other part is how do you answers compare with those of John Locke. Those are just extra information so you can get a better understanding of what they are trying to explain to you. We're going to go on and write down on the page 8, how do Americans express consent to their government? The Americans who ratified our Constitution in 1787 gave explicit consent to their new government. So did the many of immigrants who came to America to seek a better life. Those who are born here have implied their consent by remaining in this country and living under its laws. Every native-born American, as he or she grows up, has the choice of seeking the citizenship of another country. By remaining in this country, accepting its laws, and enjoying its benefits, you imply your consent to be governed by your federal, state, and local governments. You also affirm or consent or say yes to every time you take the Pledge of Allegiance. Important. Participate in an election or engage in other civic activities. What is a constitutional government? Limited governments have established and respected restraints on their powers, restraints such as laws, free or periodic elections. The opposite is unlimited government, in which those who govern are free to use their power as they choose, unrestrained by laws or elections. Tyranny, autocracy, dictatorship, and totalitarianism are other words to describe unlimited government. What form of government was best suited to prevent the abuse of power in the newly independent states of America? From their reading of both history and the natural rights philosophers, the founders believed that any government that served as its proper ends would have to be a limited or constitutional government. In a constitutional government, the powers of the person or group controlling the government are limited by a set of laws and customs called a constitution. What is a constitution? A constitution is a set of customs, traditions, rules, and laws that sets forth the basic way a government is organized and operated. Most constitutions are in writing. Some are partly written and partly unwritten, and some are not even written at all. Notice that according to this definition of the word, every nation has a constitution. Good governments and bad governments may have constitutions. Some of the worst governments have constitutions that include lists of the basic rights of their citizens. The former Soviet Union had one of the longest and most elaborate constitutions in history. But in reality, its citizens enjoyed few of the rights guaranteed by it. If you study the constitution of a government, you will be able to answer the following questions about the relationship between the government and its citizens. What are the purposes of government? How is the government organized? How is the government supposed to go about doing its business? Who is considered to be a citizen? Are the citizens supposed to have any power or control over the government? If so, how is it to be exercised? What rights and responsibilities, if any, are the citizens supposed to have? It's very important to understand that having a constitution does not mean that a nation has a constitutional government. This is important, okay? If a constitution provides for the unlimited exercise of political power by one, few, or even many, such a constitution would not be the basis of a constitutional government. If a constitution provides that the government's power is to be limited, but it does not include ways to enforce those limitations, it is not the basis of a constitutional government. In a constitutional government, the Constitution is a form of a higher or fundamental law. That law must be obeyed by everyone, including those in power. How did the founders characterize higher law? According to the founders, a constitution or higher law should have the following characteristics. It sets forth the basic rights of citizens to life, liberty, and property. It establishes the responsibility of the government to protect those rights. It establishes the principle of a private domain, which means that there are areas of citizens' lives that are no business of the government, in which the government cannot interfere. It establishes limitations on how those in government may use their powers with regard to citizens' rights and responsibilities, the distribution of resources, the control of conflict. It can only be changed with the widespread consent of the citizens, according to established and well-known procedures. This distinguishes the higher law from the ordinary law that governments regularly create and enforce. So now there's some questions about what do you think? One of the purposes of the limitations imposed by the constitutional government is to check the power of the majority. How can this be justified in a political system that is supposed to be democratic? What are the major advantages in your judgment of limited government? What are the most serious disadvantages? Are there any advantages to unlimited government? If so, what are they? How does a constitutional government protect natural rights? Constitutional government assures the rights of its citizens in two ways. It establishes limits on the powers of the government to prevent it from violating natural rights. And you might refresh yourself on what natural rights are, okay? It states that the government should be organized and its power distributed in such a way that as to increase the possibility that those limitations will be effective. The first is a purely legal protection of a citizen's freedom. The next is an organizational protection, having to do with the way in which governments operate. How can a constitutional government be organized to prevent the abuse of power? Here we go. In constitutional governments, powers are usually distributed and shared among several branches of the government. This distribution and sharing of power makes it less likely that any one branch can abuse or misuse its powers. That's where the checks and balances come in. It is also less likely that any group would gain so much power that it can ignore the limitations placed on it by the Constitution. To prevent our government from abusing its powers, the framers provided for distribution and sharing of powers among three branches of the national government. Each branch has primary responsibility for certain functions, but each branch also shares these functions and powers with the other branches. For example, the Congress may pass laws, but the President may veto them. The President nominates certain government officials, but the Senate must approve them. The Congress may pass laws, but the Supreme Court may declare them unconstitutional. It is this system of distributed and shared powers that provides the basis for checks and balances. Although each branch of the government has its own special powers, many of these powers are checked because they are shared with the other groups. The complicated ways in which constitutional governments are organized often mean that it takes them a long time to get things done. It may seem strange, but this inefficiency was seen by the framers as an advantage. They thought that these difficulties would help to prevent the abuse of power and make it more likely that when a decision was finally made, it would be a good one. The next area is the critical thinking exercises. You do not have to complete those. You do have a worksheet in your packet for this particular lesson. So that is what I'd like you to do. The critical thinking is basically getting your brain working onto how can you apply this, all right? What kinds of governments may be constitutional governments? The founders knew that the constitutional government can take many forms. It is possible to have a constitutional government with one ruler, a group of rulers, or rule by the people as a whole. So as long as those powers obey the limitations placed on them by the higher law of the Constitution, historically, constitutional governments have included monarchies, republics, democracies, and various combinations of these forms of government. History has shown, however, that problems inevitably arise when a constitutional government is ruled by one person or a small group of people. If all power is given to a select few, it's difficult to ensure that they will obey the limitations placed on them by a constitution. The rulers in such nations would control the armed forces and law enforcement agencies. How could citizens force the rulers to obey their constitution? Monarchy, rule by a king or a queen, was by far the most common form of a government in the 18th century. The founders preferred a form of government more broadly representative of the interests of the whole nation. And that's where we get into that when they were trying to get away from England and having the queen or the king be in charge of them. So, what alternative models of government could the founders choose from? The most obvious alternative to monarchy was a republic, a model of government with which the founders were familiar through their knowledge of ancient history. The founders admired the republics of ancient Greece and Rome. They also had studied more recent examples of republican governments, such as the Italian city-states of the Renaissance and the cantons of Switzerland. The founders differed among themselves about exactly what a republican government was. In general, it meant a form of government devoted to promoting the public good, the res publicae, which is Latin for thing of the people, in which political authority was shared by almost all of the citizens, rather than led by a hereditary monarch, whose political authority was exercised through the community's chosen representatives in government. Today, we view Republican and Democratic government as almost the same thing. The United States, we believe, is both a republic and a democracy. The founders, however, drew a sharp distinction between the two forms of government. Democracy had traditionally meant a form of government in which ultimate authority was based on the will of the majority. The majority usually consisted of those classes in the community that had the greatest number of people. It came from the Greek demos, meaning people. These classes tended to be the poorer people. In its purest form, democracy also meant a government in which members participated directly in their own governance instead of through representatives. The founders were familiar with the democratic institution. For generations, local government in many of the colonies tended to be democratic in nature. The New England town meeting is one example. Based on their reading of history and their own experience, however, the founders were concerned about democracy as a model for state or national government. Their preference for the Republican as opposed to the Democratic model of government influenced the framing of the Constitution. Okay, now there's two sections. Once again, food for thought. Please go ahead and do your worksheet that was developed. I had help with it, and they tried to make it pick out the higher points of it. They did a really good job, so use that. You can listen to this. You can choose to do your own reading. Have fun with it, and if you have any questions that you don't feel are answered here, just send me either an email or you can go through your teacher that checks in with you. All right? Stay safe, stay healthy, and I miss you guys.